The annual general meeting investor Q&A has finally been translated by Nintendo, and although certain details have leaked out when the meeting first took place, I always like to examine the exact wording that Nintendo put out themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean it's more accurate, since sometimes their clearing up for clarity might be shaving the rough edges of an unexpectedly candid admission, but it's probably more likely to reflect their actual intentions than some of the more instantaneous responses. Nevertheless, before I start, I just wanted to do a quick plug for Thursday's video about Nintendo and their processes around the retirement of their top developers. It's a niche and quite dry topic, and these never do all that well, but quite a lot of time went into it, and I think it puts a lot of current conversations into new perspectives, and so I do think it's well worth checking out, even if your general interest is more in Metroid speculation and such like. Anyway, without further ado, let's have a look and commentate at this Q&A. To start with, we can see the attending directors, and of course, unlike most of the quarterly reports, it's pretty much everybody. In particular, note Satoru Shibata, who is now, of course, the CEO of Nintendo of America, and of course, we've got Shigeru Miyamoto as well as Shinya Takahashi representing the game development areas, although Miyamoto isn't really so much involved with the games directly these days. We've also got some of the new directors in place as well. Let's have a look at question one. And I think this actually is a rather hostile question from an evident fan of Splatoon. Question one. With the release of Splatoon Raids approaching, how does Nintendo evaluate the previous title, Splatoon 3? Some players experienced communication errors and discrepancies in hit detection in that title. I feel that Nintendo's response to these issues may not have been consistent with sincerity, one of the values in the Nintendo DNA. Furukawa responds, we have a debugging system in place to identify and fix issues before a title is released and to reconfirm the results of those revisions so that consumers do not encounter problems when playing our games. Even after release, we closely monitor inquiries and feedback from players, and when necessary, our consumer support department promptly shares information with the development departments. When we receive a report that suggests a possible issue, we investigate the cause and take action as appropriate so that we can live up to the trust that consumers place in us. For Nintendo, our employees are the source of our competitiveness. To pass that on over the long term, we place great importance on our own Nintendo DNA, which consists of originality, flexibility, and sincerity. Responding sincerely to all matters is extremely important to the way we conduct our business. We value your feedback. Okay, I have to say I think Furukawa handled this rather hostile question quite well. I like Splatoon fine, but I'm on the casual end of things, and I have to say I'm kind of surprised that Splatoon of all games was singled out for criticism of this nature. I know Smash has had these kind of criticism for a while, and I personally found Mario Strikers Battle Leagues online basically unplayable. I guess thinking about it, I do see log-offs a fair amount on Splatoon, but that's probably to be expected, I'd have thought, with 8 people, and I'm sure my sometimes dicey internet connection has caused some problems. At any rate, Furukawa seems to have managed to bat off the question fairly easily, and I guess it just remains to be seen if there are further such concerns raised in subsequent investor Q&As and with further feedback from players. Question 2. As the number of employees increases, how will Nintendo cultivate talent and pass on Nintendo's approach to product creation, including the Nintendo DNA? Furukawa states, at Nintendo, we believe that employees can learn a great deal through their work experience. In addition to individuals improving their own knowledge and skills, we place importance on working as a team in cooperation with senior colleagues, supervisors, and other team members. To enable Nintendo's unique and family-friendly entertainment, we value our Nintendo DNA, which consists of originality, flexibility, and sincerity. We believe it is important for each employee to have opportunities to gain a variety of experience while being exposed to these values in their daily work. Nintendo's continued pursuit of new forms of fun and excitement has created opportunities for employees to take on challenges, which has also led to their personal growth. In recent years, Nintendo and its subsidiaries have been increasing headcount mainly to strengthen development capabilities in hardware, software, and the system software that supports our hardware. Even as we do so, we are undertaking various efforts from both the frontline and management sides to ensure that the Nintendo DNA is consistently passed on. We would like to continue valuing initiatives such as having Executive Fellow Shigeru Miyamoto participate in new employee training each year so that we can continue creating unique entertainment. Now, I find it interesting that he talks about bringing people in for hardware. Now, obviously, Nintendo is continuing to develop hardware in certain respects, and Switch 2 might be a more tricky technological challenge for them, given some of the issues around memory prices and such like that are emerging. But it's striking that in many respects, Nintendo has actually far fewer hardware products than ever. They've released two console models this decade. The 2010s had two classic consoles, 6DS models, and two different Switches, three if you count the red box one. It's not even like major hardware software initiatives like Ring Fit or the Wii Balance Board are as common in this decade, although I'm sure they will come in due course. Now, I've speculated that there may be more products like Alamo coming down the line, but I also suspect that a major source of angst for the company right now is where to take the Switch line after Switch 2. One iterative sequel console they've mostly got away with so far, but if they go to Switch 3, then there could be a real risk that at some point the idea will start to look a little old. I've sometimes speculated that if they ever wanted to launch a bold and radical new console, then they'd be as well to do it around 2030, just like Virtual Boy DS and Switch launched at relative high points in the Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and 3DS respectively, a little bit on the late side of their life cycles, but well before they were clapped out completely, and when those consoles still had more potential scope to last longer. And so releasing an experimental machine alongside a safer bet could be uniquely positioned, in this case to have actually Animal Crossing, Splatoon, Mario, Zelda, and Smash all appearing in the launch window or close to it, given that those titles seem to be held back for the later period of the Switch 2. I don't expect this to happen, mind you, but I do think we should be watching their hardware antics quite carefully, and it'll be interesting to see if there is any such movement later on in the Switch 2 period. I think they want to innovate, but that will obviously mean making a lot, and I mean a lot, of mistakes along the way, and so it's a very difficult thing to predict. Will we ever see the outcomes for most of these experiments? I don't know, but I think they're happening, and I think it will be interesting to see what comes. Of course, it's also exciting to know that they have more games, and of course, when they talk about the things to support the games, I imagine initiatives like Nintendo Systems and Nintendo Pictures are high on their list of considerations, and I think it will be particularly compelling to see how these become implemented ever more in the rest of the decade, as we see particularly Nintendo Pictures coming into its own. Question 3. How does Nintendo share profits with employees? Furukawa says, our basic approach is to set compensation levels appropriately, taking into account industry trends and broader societal conditions. Compensation forms the foundation of employees' livelihoods, and if it fluctuates significantly with changes in business performance, it becomes difficult for them to work with peace of mind. We believe it is important to set appropriate compensation levels in order to maintain an environment where employees can take on the challenge of creating new entertainment without fear of failure. In Japan, we raised base salaries by 10% in April 2023. Since then, we have continued to review our compensation system to ensure that employees are rewarded in a manner commensurate with their demonstrated abilities. In April 2026, we raised employee compensation again, including starting salaries. We will continue working to provide appropriate compensation for our employees. I think to Nintendo, the bit that Furukawa states here about without fear of failure is really important. And while this is broadly a non-answer, Japan has been experiencing inflation recently, albeit very mild compared to other nations. So the salary bumps, if they're not real-term increases, aren't really going to be all that significant. But despite all that, I do think that Nintendo do remunerate pretty well. Granted, Monolith Soft reportedly has had some very low starting salaries, so I'm not sure all Nintendo subsidiaries operate in quite the same way, but broadly speaking, I think their philosophy has been consistent since Iwata, which is to get in really good people, keep them by having really good salaries and apparently pretty good employee retention systems elsewhere, and to therefore make sure that they are well positioned to continue to provide excellence going forward into the future. Question 4 then. Are there any plans to make Nintendo DS or Nintendo 3DS software playable on Nintendo Switch 2? Furukawa states, at this time there is nothing specific we can share about Nintendo DS or Nintendo 3DS software. However, on Nintendo Switch 2 and Nintendo Switch, we are working to make it possible for consumers to play games that Nintendo released in the past on current hardware. By subscribing to our Nintendo Switch Online services, consumers can enjoy software from NES, Super NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo 64. On Nintendo Switch 2, consumers can also play Nintendo GameCube software. We believe that being able to play these games provides a sense of nostalgia for consumers who played them in the past, while also giving new consumers an opportunity to become familiar with Nintendo's game series and characters. Taking technical challenges and other factors into account, we would like to continue exploring a variety of possibilities going forward. I do wonder if Takahashi wanted to remind people about the Virtual Boy and all this, since it was pretty much forgotten. I saw some headlines around this to the effect that this was Furukawa confirming DS and 3DS on the NSO in due course, and while I do think that's probably likely, the wording is very careful. He just says that they want past games on the current hardware, and a variety of possibilities is quite open in terms of where they might take this idea next. Actually, I have another video that we'll release in the next few weeks addressing a different potential utilization of their back catalogue besides just the Nintendo classics. But at any rate, I do think it's pretty interesting that he talks about a sense of nostalgia for consumers, but also giving new consumers an opportunity to become familiar with Nintendo's game series and characters. And of course, the way that they've put some particularly prominent titles such as F-Zero and even, of course, past Star Foxes in the release windows of certain things such as the Switch 2, having Wind Waker and F-Zero GX at launch. Well, I do wonder if part of that is a case of thinking, let's just test the waters. Let's just see if we can get some of these properties to get some traction and perhaps also be able to judge exactly how much people play these games, where do they stop playing them if they do play them, which games particularly do they go for, what kind of icons and things appeal to people. There's quite a lot they can do with the Nintendo Switch Online service to just test things out and to see what potential different properties have. So I would say if you are interested in bringing back any particular property, it's probably not the worst thing in the world to just keep playing them on Nintendo Switch Online as opposed to any other less visible option you might have available to you. Question 5. How does Nintendo view recording, preserving, and passing on Nintendo's culture and philosophy of play through books, Nintendo Museum, and other means, and archiving them for the future? Furukawa responds, "We opened Nintendo Museum in October 2024. More than 1 year has passed, and as of the end of April 2026, over 800,000 people had visited. We believe Nintendo Museum provides a good opportunity for visitors to encounter the products and other items Nintendo has released over the years. We are aware that there are examples of past products being bought and sold as items of historical value and of efforts to publicly archive game software in the same way as books and magazines. We are very grateful this shows recognition of the value of the video games Nintendo has worked on for many years. On the other hand, we believe there are certain challenges in preserving and exhibiting past games as they are, particularly in keeping them in a playable state. Through Nintendo Switch Online, we make software from previous video game systems available to play. By continuing such initiatives, we will create opportunities for many people to experience games from the past." So I will say that one thing I'd really like Nintendo to focus on going forward is actually capturing the experiences, philosophies, and memories of some of those key staff members as they gradually leave. Miyamoto, Aonuma, Imamura, Kono, Takahashi, Koizumi, Osawa, Sakamoto, Tanabe, and others all have such incredible reserves of experience and knowledge, and of course, gradually that is going to be lost. Even if it's not made public, I really hope that there's some effort internally at least to capture these people's wisdom and thoughts and perspectives. In time, I think it's possible that there will be enough distance that Nintendo could then actually share these more publicly, but I think that's probably many decades off, since at the moment I get the sense that they want to have a more corporate identity and not to be too tied to the reputations and to the views of any particular individuals. But of course, once these people have passed into history, then I think it becomes a much more interesting feature for Nintendo to be able to talk about the kinds of people who were involved during this historic period in the growth of video games. However, for Furukawa at the present seems mostly concerned with the less philosophical aspects of this and more with how Nintendo's past can be monetized. And of course, that's fair enough given what his job is. I'll take that, it's better than nothing, but I think a lack of full attention to this kind of issue is something they may one day regret, and I certainly hope that we do see a lot more effort in this over the next decade or so. Question 6. There are cases where indie games for PC become popular, but it takes time before they are released for Nintendo Switch. What initiatives is Nintendo undertaking to shorten the porting timeline and encourage indie developers to choose Nintendo platforms earlier in the process? Furukawa responds, indie games are also very popular on our platforms. Since the Nintendo Switch generation, many indie developers have released software for our systems. We believe that unique titles based on original ideas have contributed greatly to energizing the market, as evidenced by the fact that many of them have appeared near the top of sales rankings. We also recognize that many titles are ported to our dedicated video game platforms after first gaining significant attention as PC titles. Nintendo supports indie titles by sharing information about them through initiatives such as Indie World. Through all of these efforts, we will continue working so that developers feel the benefits of releasing their titles on our dedicated video game platforms and can release them as early as possible. Now, I'm kind of amused by Furukawa's almost indignant response at the beginning here, but there's not much to add to this apart from that. I don't think Nintendo do too badly on this front, with Indie World being an especially high-profile initiative from them, but to be fair, I'm not the most across the indie scene, and I'm all for lots of different indie games getting their chance on Switch and hopefully becoming profitable for these creators. Question 7. How does Nintendo view increasing points of contact with Nintendo IP through videos and other non-game content for children who are not yet old enough to play games on their own, or for households that do not usually play games? Furukawa says, how to approach younger audiences who are not yet old enough to play games is an important challenge for Nintendo. In August 2025, we began offering a series of products in Japan that parents and children can enjoy together under the My Mario series, and sales began in the US and Europe in February 2026. For My Mario, various products are being released not only by Nintendo, but also by our partner companies, and we will continue expanding the lineup. Our core business is the integrated hardware-software business centered on dedicated video game platforms. At the same time, we want audiences who are not yet old enough to play games to also encounter our IP, including Mario. In the area of video content, last year we released Close to You, a short movie featuring Pikmin that was produced by our subsidiary Nintendo Pictures. Going forward, we will continue creating opportunities through such visual content for people who do not play games and for young children to casually become familiar with Nintendo characters. So I think this is quite an interesting response. My Mario is definitely a new departure for them, and I like that Close to You is highlighted in this conversation, and I think linking this to younger players, although probably mostly a function of the kind of question that was being asked, does make me put to mind things like potential Yoshi or Kirby developments using the Nintendo Pictures crew. The part that's not addressed is whether the cost of Switch 2 could alienate potential younger consumers where families can't afford such a pricey investment. As you'd expect, it doesn't reference any new products at this time, but I do wonder what their future plans are with regard to this, and it is something that is touched on in later questions, so let's move on for now, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in due course. Question 8. How does Nintendo assess the Indian market over the mid to long term? When developing the business there, what points will you emphasize? Furukawa says, when considering Nintendo's sustainable growth, it is an important management priority to increase Nintendo's global fan base and the number of people who enjoy our games and other entertainment. With Nintendo Switch, we have steadily expanded sales in Asian regions, including South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. There are game fans and Nintendo fans in Southeast Asia and various other regions as well. However, when it comes to building long-term relationships where people have affection for Nintendo games and characters across generations, we feel we are still in the seed sowing stage. We view India as an attractive market with a large population and significant potential. But as of now, recognition of Nintendo and Nintendo characters is not as high as in other Asian regions, which is a challenge. So, as a first step, we will steadily proceed with what we can undertake, placing top priority on familiarizing consumers with Nintendo and working to build relationships with consumers across generations. Now, I think this is a really interesting observation from Furukawa here. Firstly, it's true that when Nintendo breaks down its four big regions, Japan, the Americas, Europe, and other, It's the other that has been the big growth story over recent years, albeit from a very low base compared to the others. I like this reference, particularly from Furukawa, to the seed sowing stage of developing this intergenerational relationship with consumers, and it really does show how long-term a project they view this kind of thing. I think he's naturally setting expectations on the low side for India, and that's pretty much fair. I do have a full deep dive from a while back that is worth a look, and I'll try to remember to put it at the end of the video alongside that video on the Nintendo retirees. But in general, I do think there is long-term potential with the Indian market, and also, it must be said, with the Indian diaspora, because of course there are many different places where there are citizens of other nations who have roots in India, and of course, as people start to travel back and forth between India and the rest of the world more often, it does open more of a possibility for Nintendo's content to very naturally become more familiar to the Indian market. At any rate, let's move on to question 9, which is a very short one, which addresses another emergent market, China. Question 9 says, in China, how will Nintendo promote the use of Nintendo IP through IP licensing and other businesses that do not depend on the spread of the dedicated video game platform? Furukawa responds, for Nintendo Switch Online services in China, our partner Tencent has announced that operations will end. Through our efforts with Tencent on Nintendo Switch, we were reminded once again that there are many Nintendo fans in China. We believe that there are various ways to create opportunity for people to encounter our characters and other aspects of Nintendo IP, and that it is not just limited to our dedicated video game platform. We will continue working on these initiatives. I looked into China a couple of years ago. Nintendo does periodically try to break into China, and part of this is the unpredictability of the Chinese governments. I guess having already sown those seeds, they may find it easier to make another push into the country in future. As for the discussion of using their broader IP strategy to try to have an impact on China, I think that's largely a reaction to the fact that they don't have much choice, given the current failure of their strategy to push the Nintendo Switch. Although, of course, things could change again. I'm sure the pendulum may go back the other way in due course. Question 10. What is your view on Nintendo's current share price? Also, does Nintendo have any plans to introduce a shareholder benefit program? Furukawa responds, Nintendo's current share price is less than half the historical high it reached in August 2025. The management team, including myself as president, deeply recognizes the significant concern this has caused for shareholders. We believe various external factors are affecting the current share price, but we see it as a reflection of the market's concern about the future of Nintendo Switch 2 and of Nintendo's growth prospects as a result of the recent hardware price revision. As management, we intend to build a solid Nintendo Switch 2 install base, work to broaden the Nintendo IP fan base, and foster long-term relationships with consumers yielding tangible business results. Through these results, we seek to strengthen the stock market's confidence in the company. With regard to shareholder benefits, Nintendo has a diverse shareholder base, including institutional shareholders. For this reason, at present, we believe that dividends are the appropriate method for fairly returning profits to all shareholders. On the other hand, we recognise that individual shareholders have expressed interest in shareholder benefits aimed at fans. We will continue examining appropriate forms of shareholder return. Yeah, I'm not sure the Bank of Japan is going to want lots of Mario merch coming its way, even though some of the fans may want this if they decide to invest. Now, I did a video that broadly touched on the share price tip at the beginning of the year, but I haven't really touched it since. There are lots of things going on here with the share price, but I think what's underrated, and I think what Furukawa won't say, as he doesn't want to look like he's making excuses or appearing unambitious, is that actually there's usually a bubble around console releases, and this kind of dip isn't uncommon at all. The changes this year have basically just unwound the progress the company made to before the Switch 2 bubble at the beginning of 2024, and you can actually see similar surges and pullbacks over the years with Switch, Switch Lite, and the OLED. That's not to say that there aren't obviously other issues currently affecting the assessment of Nintendo's stock value and therefore the share price, but I think in any event there was going to be some response to the release of the system and that sort of concretizing expectations. Plus, I do think that some of their changes with regard to the value of the shares and the dividends at their previous financial statements in November probably also had a bit of an impact, as of course people might have started to invest for slightly different reasons, and it might have caused more of a movement in the shares. At any rate, let's move on to question 11, which says, how does Nintendo position forms of play that make use of features unique to smart devices, such as Pictonico, and what developments are you considering going forward? Furukawa says, for games for smart devices, we released Fire Emblem Shadows in September 2025 and Pictonico in May 2026. Pictonico is an application that lets consumers play short mini-games using photos saved on their smartphones and tablets. In addition, we continue to operate 3 other game apps, and we offer Pikmin Bloom jointly with Niantic. Shinya Takahashi chips in. He's, of course, the lead of EPD and is credited here as both a director and senior managing executive officer. Smart devices enable us to deliver games to consumers who are not playing on Nintendo's dedicated video game platforms, and to people in a broader range of countries and regions. For that reason, we would like to provide forms of play for smart devices that are suited to the characteristics of those devices. In the My Mario collection, we offer toy-like apps like Hello Mario and Hello Yoshi that give young children who have not played with a dedicated video game platform the opportunity to enjoy playing with the faces of the characters. Through smart devices, we will continue taking on new challenges from various directions. Now, it's nice to see a rare cameo here from Takahashi. I think Nintendo's actually stepped up its smartphone content quite a bit in the last year, with both Shadows and Pizza Nico being mentioned here, and I think it's very interesting when he talks about the breadth of countries and regions. I do wonder whether market research on the appeal of particular characters or series in growth parts of the world, such as India, may influence their development priorities in this respect. All that said, none of this quite answers the question, which was about the unique features of the devices themselves and how they might be used. Nintendo has often innovated with hardware, but I think the trouble is that Nintendo don't really have control over third-party technology, such as smart devices, and so in some respects they don't want to tie themselves to third-party capabilities beyond the very obvious things like cameras and digital displays, which aren't likely to go anywhere anytime soon. Question 12 then. Let's look at this one, which says, in the development of Rhythm Heaven Groove, how did Nintendo position accessibility and how did the development team approach it? Also, will Nintendo apply the knowledge gained from that process to future titles? Takahashi picks up again. The Rhythm Heaven series has long been software that people with visual impairments have enjoyed. In developing the current title, we took feedback from those consumers into account and continuously considered what we could do so even more people could enjoy the game. This resulted in various initiatives like the addition of text-to-speech features. Nintendo wants a broad range of consumers around the world to pick up and play our products. We position accessibility support as one initiative towards that goal, and we will continue valuing this way of thinking in future game development. Furukawa adds, let me also explain accessibility on Nintendo Switch 2. To support a wide range of playstyles, Nintendo Switch 2 offers various features such as adjusting screen fonts and display colors, text-to-speech for on-screen text, and changeable button mapping. Please refer to Nintendo's official website for details about each feature. Okay, shout out first of all to Controllable for this one, as it seems right in his wheelhouse. I note that Furukawa also pipes up right at the end with some very specific details. Now, this is pure speculation into the behind the scenes of these kinds of Q&As, but a few Q&As back, I think he slightly fumbled an accessibility question and seemed to be caught on the hop. But ever since being caught out, he's obviously very much got his crib sheet learned of what to say, and I think we saw a previous question where he answered very thoroughly, and this one as well, he's obviously been very keen to lay out exactly how Nintendo is appealing on the accessibility front. Now, I do think one thing with Furukawa compared to Iwata, whose Q&As I also often refer back to as part of the research of these videos, is that Furukawa is clearly very pre-prepared and professional, but also more restrained in what he says. Iwata would often explain his thinking in depth and with real nuance, but Furukawa, quite rightly in many ways, is focused on the immediate priority and being consistent with the company line, agreed of course amongst the whole leading team. Part of that is his personality, but part of that also is that despite being well established now as Nintendo's president, he's still not got the same innate authority that Iwata had as Yamauchi's hand-picked successor and a game designer who could go toe-to-toe with Miyamoto. It's not really appropriate for Furukawa to go off piste and away from the consensual agreed talking points, even if he were minded to do so, not considering the importance of maintaining harmony within the corporate culture. Now, of course, there are risks with this. Committees seldom chart the extraordinary course which Iwata did with some regularity. Of course, Iwata also had an awful lot of flops to his name, so it's not all good. At any rate, question 13. With developments such as the establishment of AI related laws in the EU, how does Nintendo view and respond to the use of generative AI trained without permission from rights holders and to the risk of intellectual property infringement caused by generative AI? Furukawa responds, "We are aware that with the rapid evolution of AI technology, countries and regions are moving forward with the establishment of laws and regulations related to AI. Nintendo will comply with these laws and regulations, and we intend to appropriately protect our intellectual property in accordance with the law. In the game industry, technologies similar to AI have long been used, for example, for the movement of opposing characters, so game development and AI technology have always had areas of close connection. These days, generative AI can be used for even more creative purposes, but we recognize that it also presents issues in areas such as intellectual property rights and power consumption. Regardless of whether generative AI is used, if Nintendo determines that something infringes on Nintendo IP, our policy is to respond appropriately, and we have no plans to change this policy. Nintendo IP did not originate as standalone characters. It was created and nurtured in connection with the unique forms of play that Nintendo has developed. We will maintain our strengths by continuing to create unique forms of play." Now, I find this an intriguing one in certain respects. Obviously, the big focus is on intellectual property rights, and that's completely understandable, especially given Nintendo's travails trying to exercise their rights in cases such as with Palworld. However, while Furukawa doesn't refer specifically to using generative AI in any future Nintendo game development, he does mention power consumption, suggesting that there are some logistical as well as ethical issues driving Nintendo's apparent reluctance to incorporate the technology in its newer games. I'm quite skeptical about Nintendo incorporating AI very often because it seems completely antithetical to their Kyoto philosophy of authentic artisanship passed down from generation to generation, but equally, I'm sure that they will want to research its capabilities, and it's likely that within Nintendo there will be people with the same mix of enthusiasm and skepticism that play out in discussions of the topic anywhere else. Okay, the next one is a really big one. First, we have the question and Furukawa's response, and then we will look to see what Miyamoto has to say. Question 14 says, regarding the basic strategy of expanding the number of people who have access to Nintendo IP, how does Nintendo look back on the initiatives it has undertaken so far, and how will you develop this strategy going forward? Furukawa says, under our basic strategy of expanding the number of people who have access to Nintendo IP, Nintendo has worked not only on initiatives in our dedicated video game platform business, but also on initiatives outside this area where people can encounter our characters such as visual content and theme parks. Through such initiatives, our aims have been to encourage people who used to play games to start up again, and to get people who do not usually play games to give them a try. This basic policy will not change in the Nintendo Switch 2 generation, and we will further develop each of these initiatives. At the same time, entertainment has diversified over the past decade, including forms that can be enjoyed at relatively low cost. In this environment, we need not only to increase points of contact, but also to make clear why consumers should choose Nintendo Entertainment. In addition to the uniqueness that only Nintendo can offer, we believe it is important to continue providing entertainment that families can enjoy together and that consumers can choose with peace of mind. Shigeru Miyamoto adds, for more than 15 years, I had been discussing with Mr. Iwata, who was present at the time, what Nintendo should become in the future. At first, I was cautious about Nintendo expanding its business to smart devices and using characters created for games outside of games. I was concerned that depending on how the characters were used, it could impose unwanted limitations when creating games. However, as we developed Wii, I realized that while there was a limit to the number of people Nintendo's dedicated video game platforms alone could reach, it is possible to reach a much larger audience through smartphones, movie theaters, YouTube, and other channels. I also thought that the purest reason for consumers to purchase a Nintendo dedicated video game platform was not because it was inexpensive or had certain features, but because they wanted to play a particular game or wanted to play Super Mario or The Legend of Zelda. From there, I thought that introducing Nintendo characters to regions and consumers unfamiliar with them would also lead to game sales in the future, so we made a significant shift towards expanding points of contact between the consumers and our characters. This strategy of expanding the number of people who have access to Nintendo IP began more than a decade ago. Today, I feel that IP related initiatives have a high profit margin and have grown as a business. They have also come to play a major role in expanding Nintendo around the world, so we will focus even more on this area going forward. One example is Pikmin Bloom, a collaborative project with Niantic. Particularly in Asian regions such as South Korea and Taiwan, it has spread significantly through social media and become an opportunity for many people to become familiar with Pikmin. We see many people, from children to adults, participating in events while wearing Pikmin hats. We view these initiatives as activities that sow seeds around the world. Going forward, we will expand these initiatives and would like to bring not only Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda, but also new characters to the world. We will expand these initiatives through a variety of methods, including movies and videos. So first of all, I just love that Miyamoto has to spotlight Pikmin especially. Never change, Miyamoto-san. It's also interesting that there's another reference to seed sowing, and I do like the fact that he specifically references bringing new characters to the world. Of course, Nintendo's had quite a bit of IP that is relatively new over the years, but not so much of it has been led by characters. Obviously, the ones that do, such as Splatoon and ARMS, garner quite a bit of attention, and even the Ring Fit Adventure characters have seen a bit of a reprise on the Alamo device. But it seems that there is definitely a potential for some kind of new major characters to be added, and it certainly seems like there's some kind of potential for something relatively soon. But at any rate, let's have a look at what else is going on. First of all, as I kind of said earlier, it's interesting that Miyamoto gives the context of the discussions with Iwata, and so while Furukawa does have this certain degree of strategic oversight for Nintendo, Miyamoto is really emphasizing the continuity across presidents here. I also think it's interesting that Furukawa evidently views these lower cost and apparently higher margin IP expansion activities as a replacement for the fact that Nintendo used to offer a low price console entry to the market, but whether that's even possible these days is becoming questionable. It might also impact things, therefore, like Switch 2's Lite model, and whether it releases soon, if Nintendo feel that a budget model of a console they want to push at a higher price point isn't necessarily their best approach at this time, especially when the existing Switch and Switch Lite still provide a lower cost option at a far better margin for Nintendo, and they can interact with Switch 2 anyway through initiatives like GameShare. I've set out an optimistic case for a Switch 2 Lite schedule in a recent video, but there's a more pessimistic and frankly realistic counterpart video that will release in the next few weeks when things are a little quieter. Miyamoto's discussion is also obviously very interesting. I didn't really expect that this discussion would go as far back as the Wii, which after all is a relatively early period in Iwata's time at Nintendo, but it also shows the desperation Nintendo clearly felt in that period. DS and Wii did turn out to be huge successes, but until then, there was a sense of the company waning in its influence, especially after Sega had crashed out of the console market at the turn of the century, with the emergence of Sony and Microsoft as significant players in it. There's also another mention of the global push here. Clearly, these kinds of things are a great way to inculcate a sense of nostalgia among people who don't have a great past affinity with Nintendo, and as Furukawa says, sow seeds for years to come. A lot of corporate reports think in relatively short time horizons, but I think it's interesting that Nintendo's approach here is literally generational. And just as decisions made 20 years ago are bearing fruits today, I think they will be perfectly happy to make decisions where the likeliest payoff will not be until the 2040s or the 2050s. Okay, question 15. In the Pokemon trading card game, there have been cases of bulk purchasing and high-priced reselling. In terms of creating an environment where consumers can purchase and enjoy the products with peace of mind, how does Nintendo view this issue, and is Nintendo working with the Pokemon Company to address it? Furukawa says, With respect to the Pokemon trading card game offered by the Pokemon Company, which is an equity method subsidiary of Nintendo, we are aware of instances where limited quantity cards are purchased in large volume, leading to high-priced reselling in the market. In response, the Pokemon Company is taking various measures, including made-to-order sales and agreements with marketplace operators. For online priority drawings for certain products, I understand that the Pokemon Company also plans to use an account verification method that utilizes My Number cards, which is Japan's official government-issued ID cards. Nintendo also communicates with the Pokemon Company as needed to discuss appropriate ways to deliver products to consumers. We believe that the Pokemon Company will continue to take measures to respond to this issue. Now, there's not much I've got to say for this, although I do think it's a pretty sad state of affairs when government ID is needed to buy Pokemon cards for the security of the player base against scalpers. At any rate, let's move on to question 16, which I think is an interesting kind of question. So question 16 says, in proposal number 4 at this general meeting of shareholders, Nintendo has proposed increasing the upper limit for stock compensation for directors. Please explain the rationale for this increase and the criteria used to determine the amount. Furukawa says, Nintendo's stock compensation is in the form of restricted stock that cannot be sold until the director retires. As such, we position it as a long-term incentive aimed at increasing corporate value over the mid to long term. The purpose of this revision to the compensation amount is to more closely link direct compensation with mid to long-term corporate value, to further enhance direct compensation alignment with shareholders, and to support Nintendo's sustainable growth. Regarding the upper limit, we determined that it was necessary to review the current level from the perspectives of securing management talent and providing appropriate incentives. As for the criteria, we referenced the research results for executive compensation levels from external research organizations, and the matter was also deliberated by the Nomination Advisory Committee, which is comprised primarily of outside directors. The amount approved at the general meeting of shareholders merely represents the upper limit for compensation. The actual compensation amounts will vary within that limit depending on the management environment and other factors, but the focus continues to be to increase performance and corporate value over the mid to long term. Now, as I say, this is a pretty interesting question. Furukawa's response, though, in certain respects, I'm a little skeptical. I mean, yes, it is true that if you raise the potential compensation, you might get stronger candidates to be directors, but I would have thought that Nintendo wouldn't have too much of an issue of attracting interested and capable directors anyway. Now, yes, it's also obviously true that it will incentivize people to increase the stock of Nintendo and increase the value of the company over the medium term, but what about the long term? Now, most directors are in their 50s or 60s. Yes, there are a few people with very deep roots at director level, but in general, we're talking a decade or so, not multiple decades. I think the reality is that they had the money as a consequence of being overcautious and hedging before Switch 2 launched, and then Switch 2's relatively strong success seemed like a good opportunity to reconsider things. And of course, we've got initiatives like the changes to the dividend provision, and of course, therefore, the direct compensation kind of goes alongside with it. At any rate, the next one is probably the biggest one in terms of this particular meeting. Question 17. Please tell us why Executive Officer Tezuka is concluding his term and how he will be involved with Nintendo going forward. I would also like to hear a few words from him. Furukawa says, Mr. Tezuka joined Nintendo in 1984 and has been involved in the development of many software titles, including Super Mario Bros. For the family computer system. He will step down as executive officer due to the expiration of his term, but he will continue to be involved in development at Nintendo. Takashi Tezuka says, if I were to look back on the 42 years since I joined the company and summarize them in a single phrase, I would say I got to do some very fun work. When I first joined Nintendo, the development environment necessary for game development generally did not exist, and part of the fun was in creating it ourselves. Today, within a large-scale development structure, there is great enjoyment in bringing together the expertise of many people in our creative process. Also, when I think about how to apply each emerging new technology, such as 3D, stereoscopic imaging, and motion capture to game development, I feel a kind of excitement that makes me think I could continue being a developer without ever getting bored, and I would like to continue doing so in the future. Nintendo's work involves the entire company, considering how to develop, manufacture, and deliver to consumers products that many people can enjoy, while flexibly creating these products in response to changes in the business environment. I am very happy that I have worked at a company that can take on such initiatives. I will step down as an executive officer, but I plan to continue working for Nintendo as a production producer. I am grateful to have been given this opportunity to offer my appreciation to everyone at this milestone. So early reports did suggest that this was followed by a massive round of applause for Takashi Tezuka, and frankly, nothing could be more deserved. There's something about Tezuka. Lots of the top developers at Nintendo are great, and many have a kind of twinkle in their eye, but there's a quality of just pure, joyful kindness and purity that radiates from Tezuka, and I really hope that he has a long future ahead of him working at Nintendo and creating great games, as long as he finds fun and enjoyment in it. So, although I referred to this on my recent video on Nintendo retirees, I didn't want to fully cover it without looking at Nintendo-specific wording. I referred to that video for full details of what I expect the role of these post-65 producers may be, and some of the considerations that are taking place at Nintendo. It's great that he still feels involved, and I think the term production producer is an interesting one. Of course, he's only held his executive role since 2018, so it's not that big a part of his Nintendo history. What will be most telling is from about 2027 to 2028, how many games will have Tezuka directly as a producer, as opposed to a more distant supervising figure. I've illustrated other cases where clearly top developers were stepping back significantly after those milestone ages, such as 50, 55, and 60, even if they were notionally at the company. From his prodigious recent output, I really doubt that Tezuka was working much less than full-time, but I could see that in the next 5 to 10 years, he would move towards something more like where Sakamoto has been for the last decade or so, seemingly deeply involved in a few big projects, but generally probably at a far more considered pace. And I strongly suspect that Sakamoto was not working full-time for at least the last several years, if not the last 10 years. Question 18 then. When Nintendo Direct is streamed on external platforms such as YouTube, there would seem to be risks such as information being leaked in advance. Does Nintendo have any plans to create its own means for delivering information directly to consumers? Frokar responds, in the Nintendo Direct streamed on June the 9th, 2026, we shared information about new titles scheduled for the end of 2026 and for 2027 and beyond, including Nintendo titles. We are grateful for the many positive reactions to the lineup we announced. Nintendo is constantly investigating ways to provide information directly to consumers, including through Nintendo Today and other means. Currently, Nintendo Direct is watched by many consumers around the world. While continuing these activities, we will keep exploring what forms of information delivery are appropriate going forward. He doesn't really, I've got to say, address what's basically the hate question. What do you do about the fact that some of these big things do tend to be leaked in advance? But then I suppose there's not much you can do apart from trying to get the Nintendo ninjas to work overtime. I've talked about this kind of thing, though, many times in the past. And indeed, I did a video about 6 months before they launched Nintendo Today about how I thought they would ultimately be changing up the Nintendo Direct-led announcement structure, which was a bold new initiative when Iwata came up with it around 2011, but by now has started to feel its age and perhaps become something that they could pivot towards some different opportunities for. Now, I personally like a good Direct, and this Q&A pretty much confirms that they will be continuing with both Direct and Today, but I am interested to see what other options they might employ in future. One concept I always thought could be amazing is something akin to a cross between a Splatfest and Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour, where you have a virtual show floor, and for a very limited window, Nintendo stream in trailers, gameplay demos, and such like, so that you can wander around and see what's new, kind of like an interactive Direct and Treehouse. Of course, the reality is that for most people, most of the announcements aren't going to be really all that hype. Even many Nintendo fans don't care for every property out there, and so I don't think necessarily that there's much they can do to top a really good, strong Direct, which has a massive, deep library of games. But all that said, I think they will continue to experiment, and it'll be interesting to see how things settle down. Okay, question 19, and this is the last question, and it's a big one. What impact will rising memory prices have on Nintendo Switch 2 production and profitability, and how will Nintendo respond going forward? Furukawa says, for memory-related components, we are continuing discussions with our business partners regarding supply from a long-term perspective. At this time, we expect to be able to meet our production plan for the current fiscal year, but there is still uncertainty in the market environment, so we will continue to closely monitor the situation. Procurement costs for memory-related components did not have a significant impact on our results for the previous fiscal year ending March 2026. However, starting from the current fiscal year, we expect to be affected by rising component prices, including for memory. We are preparing our business plan for the next fiscal year on the assumption that a similar trend will continue. As a response to changes in the market environment, including these increases in component prices, we recently announced price revisions for Nintendo products, including Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. However, precisely because we are in this kind of environment, we believe it is important to continue creating compelling reasons for consumers to purchase the hardware because they truly want to play particular software titles. We will continue responding flexibly to the market environment while aiming to maximize our integrated hardware-software entertainment business. So this is another interesting response, especially a suggestion that the trend, i.e. escalating prices, will continue, and certainly from the mood music over at Sony, that appears to be very much their judgment as well. I actually think the last bit is important though. Cutting prices or ameliorating price rises are always what consumers demand, but actually for a business, it's often far smarter to target value increases. And Nintendo has a lot of high-value properties currently on the bench. 3D Mario, Animal Crossing and Smash, to name just a few. The best thing they can do in many respects is to keep their hardware sales flow relatively high but also consistent. Pushing to sell too much right now might not necessarily be the best thing given their production plan for the current fiscal year is probably reflective of their current trajectory and what they expect to sell. Sometimes it seems painful that Nintendo is so withholding, but I think keeping their foot on the gas pedal so they can respond very precisely to road conditions is actually a key part of their successful strategy to navigate this early part of the generation. I could definitely see, after a big price increase, a bit more of a blowout on future games. I'll be surprised if we don't at least see a glimpse of the next Mario this year. And indeed, if they are expecting to see even more significant increases in the costs of memory, then that's going to go into their margins until or unless they do a further price hike. And so in terms of their margins, the absolute best case scenario for Nintendo is to sell a lot of games in September. All the more reason why I would expect a significant September Direct. But all things considered, I don't think they're likely to change their plans all that much because they really want the option of being able to have their big guns come out if they need to. They've done this before. Think the Wii U, where they announced so much very early on, but the effectiveness of this can be short-lived, and it can also store up problems for later, as we've seen with the necessity by the beginning of the Switch era to announce very long-term games such as Metroid Prime 4 and Bayonetta 3, and potentially neither case did it really actually benefit them, because sometimes that actually created a level of expectation that arguably the games were not able to meet. At any rate, that's it for this larger than usual Q&A. The annual meeting ones are always chunky ones, presumably because they're the best attended. Do check out that video I've referenced a few times on the screen right now. You can support the channel on Patreon on the link below. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.